Welcome to another episode of Hi Ed Unpacked. I'm George Glover. I'm joined by my co-host Tim. Tim, great to have you on board.
Great to be here.
Yeah, today we're joined by the wonderful Loren Neudorf. Loren, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, you're obviously the Dean of La Trobe University. We're going to of law, sorry. We're going to get a little bit into sort of what your day job looks like. But perhaps for those people listening right now, I can kind of spin off your wonderful kind of rap sheet here. So you hold a PhD in law from the University of Cambridge, decorated career working across education, obviously with a focus on law, which includes time working in Cambridge, working in Canada, your homeland, and also working in a number of organisations here in Australia. So, and on top of all of that, also holding an advisory position within government. So super excited to have you here. I know we're going to be kind of diving into some really interesting topics about kind of the future of law from an education point of view, but also just from how kind of law is changing, as kind of technology and, the world rapidly evolves. But perhaps before we kind of get into that, if you could kind of just give us a little bit of a overview of the current roles you kind of hold at the moment at La Trobe and also within the government.
Yeah, great. Thanks, George. So at La Trobe, as you said, I'm the Dean of the Law School there. So La Trobe is one of 8 law schools here in Melbourne. There's a very big market for law, but we do things a little bit differently there. So as the leader, it's a really exciting place for me to kind of make an impact. We have something called transformative education. And what I mean by that is more than 40% of the students at La Trobe are the first in their family to go to university.
Oh, wow.
And so it's a really kind of interesting, diverse cohort of students that we have, which is a little bit different from some of those other universities that are here also in Melbourne. So it's a really exciting opportunity for me to deliver that transformative education, to lead a group of great academics who are delivering really high quality educational experiences for the students. I come from Canada, as you mentioned. I'm the first in my family to go to university.
Oh, cool.
I come from a very small, kind of a fairly insular community. It's like, you probably have heard of Amish people before.
Yeah.
So Mennonites are kind of the cousins of the Amish.
Okay, yeah.
So my family is not as, hardcore or traditional as you might see kind of them portrayed, but I come from a pretty kind of a community where people didn't go to university.
Yeah.
You kind of get a job at 13 or 14 on the family farm, and that was kind of the rest of your life, so to speak. And so I've had a very different kind of upbringing, but I really can see the value and the potential of the university education experience. It really sets people on a very different path for the rest of their lives, and their kids are much more likely then to go to university as well. So it's really exciting being at La Trobe and being able to lead that group. The other thing that you mentioned is my work with the government. So that's a role with the Parliament of Australia. So I've been appointed by the Senate in Canberra to be a legal advisor to a committee there. The technical name of the committee is the Senate Standing Committee for the Scrutiny of Delegated Legislation.
Is there an acronym?
There kind of is, but it's not a great acronym. It's not an easy one to remember. So that committee is kind of a unique committee within the Parliament. So something that people often don't appreciate is that most of the laws that are made in Australia actually don't go through the Parliament. There's no debate, there's no 3 readings, there's no votes on those laws. They're made as what's called as delegated legislation. Parliament's a busy place. It does not have the time or the expertise to make every single law. So what it does is it actually takes a lot of its own lawmaking power and borrows it, essentially delegates it down to the executive branch, to ministers, to the cabinet, to the prime minister, to an agency, and they make laws directly. So this committee is, Parliament's still in charge at the end of the day.
Yeah.
That's borrowed power. And so this committee scrutinizes and analyzes those laws that are being made by the executive to make sure that they meet certain expectations. It's not about policy, but it's about the technical qualities of that law.
Yeah.
So I give advice to the committee in that way. Yeah.
Sweet. Well, I'm sure we're going to be talking about some of that, how that legislation has been impacted in terms of what's kind of happening in the world of technology. But perhaps before we get into that, a few kind of quick fire questions to get to know you for our audience. So why don't we start off with your first car?
Oh gosh, it was a Honda Civic, a 1991.
I love it. Color?
Green.
Yeah, nice. What was the best thing that happened to you in high school? And where did you go to high school as well?
So very small city in regional Manitoba, Canada. So I ended up going to a public high school because my sort of private school ended at year 9. So I got to flick over into a public school. My best experience probably was getting elected to the student council. That was really exciting.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Love it. Biggest challenge, obviously, we spoke earlier kind of off camera, talking about the fact that I moved here 12, 13 years ago. You mentioned you've been here for 9 years. What was like the biggest challenge you found moving from Canada here to Australia?
I know this is going to sound completely crazy, but actually I feel colder in Australia than I do in Canada. So I moved here in June of
you chose Melbourne, like you could have gone to Queensland, you know?
That's right. I woke up this morning, it was 2 degrees. I should have gone to Queensland. No, just kidding. But it is funny. So when I first came here, I didn't realize, so Canadians have this kind of view of Australia. It's very beachy and sunny and warm all the time. And I arrived in June and it was like, gosh, it's really dark and it's really cold, and the houses and everything are just, I think, built to a slightly different standard than in Canada. So there's not as much insulation, the single pane glass.
Prepared for it.
Yeah, so I feel cold in my house all the time, and I think, gee, in Canada it'd be 40 below zero, and I don't feel cold in my house. But here it's 5 degrees and I'm freezing, right? So I think that was the biggest shock in a way.
So are you getting double glazing?
I should be getting double glazing. I haven't invested in it yet, but I really should actually. Yeah, I put up like kind of the things under the door and the things on the windows that pull all the blinds down to try to keep the house a bit warmer. Yeah.
And final question for the quickfire round. I know obviously Canadians are very passionate sports fans like us Kiwis and Australians. If you were going to be a sports star, what would be the sport? Well, and who's your team as well?
Oh, this is a hard question. So Canadians obviously love ice hockey. Yeah. That's our sport. We don't even say ice hockey. I have to say that in Australia. We just say hockey, right? Yeah. That's the default. But Winnipeg Jets would be my team. They're a great team. But I also play baseball here in Australia. I play in a social league here in Melbourne. So I love baseball, and I think if I were like to have my dream, I'd be like playing for the Toronto Blue Jays or something.
And because Stanley Cup's on right now, and I believe a Canadian team has the chance to be the first Canadian team to win in like 30 years or something. So I can't remember what the series is sitting at, but I was listening to the NBA and they were talking about it the other day.
It's a big deal. The Oilers are behind right now. The Edmonton Oilers. But it's a rematch from last year as well. So there's a lot of pressure on them to win, and all of Canada is really rallying around, particularly with the rhetoric coming out of the US around 51st state.
Canada v. US.
It's a big deal. So people are really kind of watching this really
it's
closely.
Kind of not to digress, but wild when you think about, I think like the last 5 Stanley Cups have been won by like teams from Florida and California when you think about ice hockey.
I know. But I'll tell you the secret to that actually is if you look at the roster of the team and see how many Canadians are playing for them. In some cases, a majority of Canadians on the American teams. So this is always the challenge in Canada is, the American market is a bigger market, so there's more, money there.
More money,
so attracting kind of the best players. And this is always the thing with Canada. It kind of hollows out our,
when Gretzky,
our league.
went to the Kings.
That was exactly right, and he won so many Stanley Cups with the Oilers. Exactly right, and then it was like, he's off to the off to the US. So yeah.
Sweet. Well, enough about sports. I could talk about that topic for I'm sure for an hour, but obviously we're here to chat more about kind of education and your role. I suppose perhaps if we want to kind of just start up, obviously. We're in this crazy evolution, kind of the third or fourth kind of coming of the digital age, if you want to call it, in terms of AI. Really interested to hear how you guys are thinking, how you specifically are thinking about artificial intelligence as it relates first and foremost to law. And then maybe law education as kind of the second part of that question.
So that is a huge question to answer. And I will tell you just right now, I don't have all the answers to that. We are kind of watching something unfold before our very eyes, which is very dynamic. And there's a lot of kind of things I think we can't fully anticipate about where this is ultimately going to go. But just a few things in terms of the law side of it. So AI, is seen as potentially a tool that lawyers can use in their practice to cut down on certain parts of the workload. As you will know, if you've talked to a lawyer working in a law firm, they have very heavy hours, very significant hours. They have sometimes billable hours targets that they have to, meet. But AI kind of is seen as having the potential to do some of the legwork on different matters. For example, legal research. Being able to synthesize a huge data set of case law, for example, cases from all kinds of different jurisdictions in Australia. Can you really synthesize this, to give me kind of a clear statement of what the law might be? So the common law method that we use in this country And this is kind of this has given a lot of work to lawyers as well, but it is all about kind of bringing different elements of, the case law and the precedent together. And of course, reading that, in light of what the legislation is, because often that case law is interpreting legislation. And so this is a skill set that a lawyer has.
Yeah.
But the problem with it is that you only have so many hours in the day, and you got to find all these cases in all these different jurisdictions at different levels of court and from different time periods. And so, trying to synthesize that is a big task. And so getting kind of maybe a first draft of a memo of research summarizing what the law is probably a very interesting kind of application of AI. We'll talk about the pitfalls and the risks, at some point, I'm sure. Yeah. And there's a lot there.
But just before we get there, then, Loren, you've got the potential to synthesize and summarize huge volume of data or bring it in really easily with ChatGPT or many other tools. What are you missing then? As a young lawyer, you haven't done the reading, but you've got a summary in front of you.
So this is actually, I think, one of the hugest problems because, so if you look at the graduate level positions, often the work in those entry level positions was doing this kind of work. The senior lawyer would say, go and find the case law about this particular issue. And you'd spend, days and days and your evenings and your weekends, but that's actually an important part of the learning process.
Sure.
So the challenge, I think, for junior lawyers, one of the challenges is going to be, how do you have discernment? How do you have judgment? How do you know that that's an accurate summary or synthesis of the law? And I think that's going to be the challenge. If you've never actually developed those skills yourself and you've just relied on the technology, you look at that and say, well, it looks right or it sounds right. Yeah. How do you really know? A senior lawyer could look at that and pick it apart in 5 seconds and say, well, they've missed this or that's actually not the accurate. And law is so technical, right? Every word matters. You go to the High Court of Australia and there will be an entire case about one word, in income tax legislation, right? What does it really mean? So when you get to that level of hyper technicality, this stuff is really important. And so if you're a junior lawyer who's kind of using these tools and that kind of, legwork or that kind of, I don't mean to disparage it, but we can call it grunt work in a way, right? If you actually haven't been doing that and learning the lessons about the nuance of the law, the sophistication of the law, how do you actually exercise that judgment? We have a group of lawyers now that did all that. They went through the paces and they have those skills. But this new group coming out, that's going to be an interesting problem.
But there is this whole conversation around, well, will there be jobs for new lawyers? We know at the present only even before AI came out, only 1 in 12 law graduates in Australia were going on to practice. What's this going to do for the job market for someone studying law right now?
It's a great question. And this is what law schools have to be on top of, right? So what are we offering that is distinctive and innovative in that space and equipping our students to have the best chance of success out in that job market? A couple things I'll just say about the market in general. So where I come from in Canada, law is only a postgraduate degree. Now, there's one caveat to that, which is Quebec, which is a French civil law system within a bigger common law national system in Canada. So you can go directly out of high school to do a law degree in Quebec, which is the French, the continental model, as well as the English model normally. But in Canada, we have the American model, which is law is a Juris Doctor degree. You go and do an undergraduate degree first in something else. It can't be law. It has to be something else,
I didn't know
science
that.
Or whatever, politics, economics. And then you go to law school. So what's interesting about that is that in the Canadian market then, you don't have as many graduates coming out from law because not everyone just going straight out of high school, I got a high ATAR, I probably should go to law because that's what people do with a high ATAR, right? You have a very deliberative choice that people are making to go to law school in Canada because they've done a 3 or 4 year undergraduate degree. They often work in industry for 1 or 2 years first, and then they write an LSAT and it's hyper competitive, and there's only a small number of law places available because it's a different kind of model. So in Australia, we don't have that. We have kind of like a, maybe I don't want to call massification, but we do
volume.
have a volume. It's a volume thing, right? So, I mentioned 8 law schools here in Melbourne alone, right? There are 38 law schools across this country. That's a lot. I sit on the Council of Australian Law Deans. There's a lot of colleagues around that table. And look, there's some there's fantastic law schools that are doing amazing things in Australia. But I guess the question will be, we already have a model where we're graduating a lot of law students, and there's a lot of people with law degrees. Now, not everyone wants to be a lawyer, okay? That's one thing. But for those that do, trying to equip them to be able to have that best chance of getting that job is really important to us. And I think at La Trobe, for example, we offer something different. Our demographics are different. So you're talking about diversity in the law. So you go to a law firm, you go to the courts. So judges hire what are called judicial associates. These are recent graduates from a law program, right? right? They do work for the judge. They do research for the judge. And I would say, historically, often these sorts of positions go to people from a very kind of a slice of those law schools. And those students often come from particular private schools and they feed into those. So we have something very different at La Trobe, which actually now is being more and more recognized in the legal industry. And I was just having a conversation with some judges on the Supreme Court at an event, and they're looking for those different perspectives on the law, the diverse perspectives. So that's something I think we can offer at La Trobe that not every other law school offers. But this is a challenge, right? We have to deal with this and we have to address it squarely and look at what are the prospects for those students coming out. Yeah.
So if you then, stepping aside from the immediate market and go 25 years forward, the Accord wants to double the number of students in higher education. Can we double the number in law schools? Should we double the number in law schools, or actually should we be shrinking?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, if I look at the whole thing holistically, as a market, I would say a couple of things. The first is that a legal education is a great education.
Yeah.
So even if you do not become a lawyer and you don't want to become a lawyer, it is going to train you to think in a very analytical way, in a rigorous way. You're going to have attention to detail in whatever field you ultimately go into. So, you look at people who have careers in politics or in business, all kinds of different industries. Finance, exactly right, with a law qualification. So it allows them to kind of think in a different kind of a way and in a technical way. So it's a great education is the first thing I would say about it.
How do you win that argument with the Dean of Arts?
It's a challenge. Look, and we have a double degree, so that's one other option, right?
True.
So, for example, at La Trobe, we have a number of degrees where you can do law and arts in 5 years. You get 2 degrees essentially. So actually, then you can dip into arts and humanities. You also get that rigorous kind of training from a legal, hyper-technical perspective. One thing that's different about law, though, law is an accredited law degree, which qualifies you ultimately to become a lawyer and become a legal practitioner. And there's a few other things you have to do after you get your law degree. But, this sort of thing, we learn doctrine. Doctrine is interesting. It's a little bit different, right? Because you're actually learning the rules, how the rules are applied, the nuances of the rules, as kind of someone who's being initiated into a system. Whereas, the arts and humanities, it might be a little bit more, here are the systems, right? We're kind of looking at it from a bit more of a detached perspective. Law, you're inside. You're an insider in that world. You become like a priest of the church of law, for lack of a better analogy, right? And so, in a way, that kind of training is also really interesting training because you get the inside view. And we do offer critical perspectives, but most of our curriculum is core curriculum. We have, a body, the Victorian Legal Admissions Board. They set what we have to teach, prescribed areas of knowledge, and that's most of a law degree, right? So you have to kind of learn the inside. How does it work if a client comes to you? What is the answer to their problem legally?
You mentioned differentiation and the importance of diversity. Obviously, you talked about the student diversity, but in terms of diversity, when you're competing in a market, you mentioned there's 38 different universities offering law. What at La Trobe, where does that differentiation come in? And I guess tying it to the previous question is it about creating a bunch of different pathways for these students so they can kind of choose their own adventure as they move forward? I mean, I totally agree. Fundamentals from, studying law is going to set you up. And I think of tons of friends who are in property or in finance who have studied law, so I agree with you there. But yeah, from a La Trobe point of view, how do you differentiate, and what does that look like practically in a market where you're competing with 38 other universities?
Yeah, so great question. A couple of things to say on that. So the law school at La Trobe is almost 33 years old, so it's a pretty new school, which means we've always been doing things a little bit differently, right? I used to be at a different university that was 130 years old in law, the University of Adelaide, right? They had a very long-standing tradition in the way that they delivered legal education. We have always we started out doing things already a little bit differently. Those alternative career paths that you're mentioning is absolutely a key part of what we try to educate our students on. So for example, next week I'm going to an alumni event here in Melbourne City, and we have a speaker talking about non-traditional careers in the law with a law degree. And that's the kind of stuff that we let our students know about so that they have those kind of ways of thinking about what they can do, the versatility of that degree to open up a lot of doors. I always say in my open day presentation, a law degree is a door opener for you, right? So it opens and you can choose which door you ultimately want to go into. One thing that distinguishes La Trobe, though, I would say as well from other universities in Australia, is that we take a lot of pride in developing practical legal skills with our students. And that is something where, some degrees might be a little bit more, I want to say, theoretical, or, you're in the classroom learning from the, professor. That's great, really valuable. And it's always good to have a critical and theoretical perspective on the law. But what we do really successfully at La Trobe is we then take that theory, the classroom knowledge, and we have a lot of opportunities for our students to actually apply that in real scenarios. So, for example, we have a law clinic up at Whittlesea Community Connections in Epping Plaza up in Epping. And what we do there is the students come through, I think over 300 students last year, and they're working with real clients, people who couldn't otherwise afford a lawyer, for example. They work under a supervising lawyer, and they get to take what they've learned in the classroom, and they get to now meet a real client who has a real problem, and then they actually have to understand, how do I interview a client? How do I get the right facts out of the client to be able to give them the proper advice? How do I take a file note? How do I maintain confidentiality about this matter and make sure that the information is protected, right? We can talk about some AI risks there as well. But so this kind of thing is something we have the earliest placement opportunity for our students in all of Victoria for law students. Yeah. That's a second year, and they can then do another one in their third year.
And that's legal aid, is it you're referring to, or it's different?
So it's not funded through legal aid. We actually fund it independently. Okay. So it's not formally legal aid. It's a La Trobe Law Clinic in partnership with Whittlesea Community Connections. We do dip into community legal centers that do provide legal aid as well, and we have placements there, but that's not our own branded one. This is our own branded one. So if you go to the shopping center, you'll see our name on the door, La Trobe, Law Clinic, right? So you can come in there and get that legal advice.
Yeah, again, we're going to start talking about technology, and I feel strongly about the benefit of the face-to-face practicing, getting in there kind of early. I studied a Bachelor of Design, went to the School of Art and Design in Christchurch, where a lot of my friends who studied design went to University of Otago, where it was all theoretical versus what I did was very practical. And kind of most of those friends ended up doing like a BCom and kind of transitioning out of kind of advertising and I think the reason for that was because the engagement and the kind of leveraging and using that kind of muscle to kind of be in market, working with people, testing your ideas and, succeeding, failing kind of is critical to being able to accelerate your progress to actually getting a job.
Absolutely. And can I just jump in on that one? So that's a really great point. And I think with our students in particular, given the demographics I mentioned, often one of the challenges we have, and I know this coming from, a family where nobody went to university in my family, there's a confidence gap. And so this is a challenge for me to overcome. It's a particular passion of mine at La Trobe, actually, is helping students who, they walk in on their first day of law school and they look around and they think, gee, is this really for me, right? Yeah. Do I have what it takes? Can I get that job when I get out of this degree? And so giving them the practical skills and some small wins, early on in their academic careers, starting to give them that confidence they need to then rise up to say, I can do this, right? I actually was able to help a real client. So in this clinic I mentioned, in just over a period of a year, we had over $300,000 of traffic fines and other fines wiped out for our clients. And these are people from a community where that kind of thing is a huge deal. We actually measure
council has currently got, you're on a dartboard in the council parking office right now.
Exactly right. Exactly right. We lost revenue. But it's one of those things where these people, you measure it in grocery bills or, weeks of rent, the huge impact of that kind of thing. And those are the students who are actually doing that. The one other thing I just want to say about that as well, if I can, is that our students actually take a kind of a holistic view of the law. They see the social side of the law. Yeah. And I think that's really important. We have a commitment of social justice at La Trobe, which is also distinguishing. So yes, we have people going into great corporate commercial law firms. We have all of those great students. The Deputy Premier Victoria, he's one of our law graduates. So we have people in very, very, important, good places in these, traditionally kind of perceived as the most desirable places to go. But we also have this kind of social justice conscience where we actually do work with the community. We want to give back to the community. So even if you go and become a big fancy corporate lawyer, you should be giving something back, pro bono work or dipping in on the evenings or weekends to Fitzroy Legal Service, giving back in a way to the community. That's something we really try to embed. And our students love it because they see the value of that, right? From their own families, from their own communities. Sure. Yeah. And so they see, law actually has a lot of power in a society and you can use it as a way to really help people along that might be really stuck. They might have a language barrier, culture barrier, the financial barrier to legal representation. You can really make a big difference in someone's life.
Particularly with the generation kind of coming through, we see it in terms of how a fundamental purpose is to kind of the career choice and kind of going with employer A versus employer B, or at the point of, choosing what career they're going to go down, and like thinking about, what kind of impact can I have kind of within this role is becoming more and more critical to how people think about, which employer they're going to choose, what career they're going to do. So like, I definitely think, leaning into that, and hopefully that will kind of grow and we'll see kind of more of that over the coming years.
Absolutely. How much of this links into your childhood? You talk, because I'm really interested in that story of yours. So you grew. What was the name of the town you grew up in?
So Brandon, Manitoba is my small city. About
Sounds
40,000
like something
people.
out of a Netflix special. And so you grew up there. At what point did you think, I want to be Dean of Law?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a hard question to answer without giving me a whole life story.
Yeah,
but
just give me the first little glimpse. You at 14.
So me at 14, it was kind of interesting. I was born and raised on a farm, right? So strawberry farm. My dad he's still farming to this day. He does other things now, flaxseed and soy and a few things.
And you picked strawberries?
Absolutely. Not only did I pick strawberries, I did, I planted the strawberries. You snip the blossoms so they can grow. The plant grows a little stronger in the first season. You weed it. You do all the things on the farm.
And it was just at that moment you thought, I've seen enough of strawberries.
I'm out of here. No, to be honest, so I'll tell you. I mean, it's my personal story, but I don't have any problem telling people. So I'm gay, and it's not accepted in that community to be gay. So at a very early point in my life, I thought I had this kind of dissonance with the religious kind of doctrine that my family holds, and then kind of my own personal kind of feelings. And these things were not. I couldn't find a way to make them compatible with each other, essentially. So in a way, I used education, and I went to university as a way to kind of escape from my family, basically. So when I was 18, that Honda Civic, bought a car, moved to Calgary, did my undergraduate degree in Calgary, and this was sort of a big deal for me to go to a city, right, from this kind of upbringing. Yeah. But it was the way out, and I've used my education. So I didn't know. I always loved law, and
Can I just investigate that further?
Sure.
So in terms of the way, so you could have become a strawberry farmer in another area. You could have gone into plumbing. There's a range of why then chase that dream?
So I always was fascinated by rules and society, the way that things were ordered and structured, right? And I think probably coming from a pretty strict religious background, there's a lot of rules. You see different interpretations of the rules, and it always fascinated me, just like how society organizes, how communities organize themselves, and law plays an important role in that sort of thing. So even as a kid, I remember once I was at a yard sale and I picked up this law dictionary, and I would just flick through this law. I'd be reading all these terms. I was like, this is so cool. There's like a whole kind of, system of rules going on here that's really complex. And so I was always fascinated by kind of that ordering and kind of, how power in a way in a society it manifests itself through decisions that then, people have to follow the rules, and then, the rules get changed over time, maybe because things evolve or change in the society.
Is there something also in that the laws which excluded you then gave you more interest in the laws? Like there is some sort of irony there, or maybe it's actually that's the motivation.
You know what? I think being able to see law, particularly secular law, because I know what the religious law was like, but seeing the potential and the power for me to kind of have equality or rights, or that law can be used as an instrument in such a way, I think for me was always so fascinating. Now, of course, at that time, Canada didn't have gay marriage, for example, but it did have rights for, persons who were in same-sex relationships and that sort of thing. And so I think, and, from my family's perspective, that wasn't necessarily a good thing, but I saw that law had this amazing kind of power, transformative power in society. And I was just drawn to that kind of idea. And it was so interesting. When I did my undergraduate degree, I did a science degree, actually, because I had to do something else before I could go into law. And I did probably the thing that would be the most opposite for a Mennonite farm boy, which is I did a computer science degree. So I was like technology to the max, right? Because I was so interested in kind of like technology as well. So in a way, kind of being limited and sheltered from some things, it really just piqued my interest almost more than it otherwise probably would have. And law has been, and in my career, I've seen the power of law. Law cannot be disconnected from a society. You can't just, if you go into another country in the world, you can't just drop in a bunch of laws and the society will change or, adapt to that immediately. It will not. So law has to always, there's a connection there. It has to be, in tandem with what the society is. It can be a leader sometimes. You can nudge along a society or an economy or whatever, but it cannot be totally removed or disconnected. Otherwise, you actually lose respect for the law. You don't even have a rule of law system anymore, and people find other ways of doing things basically outside the law, which is kind of defeating the purpose of it, right? But it is a really powerful instrument, and I think I've always just been fascinated by that aspect.
And so you've become an expert of the law rather than a changer of the law?
Interesting question. So academics, one of the best things we can do is influence law reform. And so I've been really privileged to have an opportunity to write a lot on what I think are, really key legal issues. I use a comparative method. Being from Canada, I studied in the UK as well. Okay. So having this kind of comparative method, I look at New Zealand sometimes, I look at the US, and I've looked at India, Malaysia, Pakistan, all these different jurisdictions. These are all common law jurisdictions, so we share a similar kind of heritage to our legal system. But what I've been able to do with a comparative method is it's such a creative way of looking at how other people solve problems with law. So you can see, in India, for example, they have this rule. That's interesting. How does that work exactly? Could Australia learn something potentially from that, right? So looking at this kind of cross-pollination of ideas also probably relate to my childhood. I was always a bit of an outsider in a way. Even though I'm in the system, I knew I was different, right? And so learning from other people's kind of like legal systems and legal cultures has been a really important part of my research. And so one of the things I've been able to do when you talk about change in the law is when I publish, research, book chapters or articles in peer-reviewed journals, for example, sometimes they get picked up by change makers. So I'll give you an example. I woke up one morning and it turned out the Supreme Court of Canada had cited an article I had written in the majority and the dissenting judgment. And my friends were emailing me, what's going on? Like your article is, and now being discussed by the Supreme Court of Canada. You don't know what impact you're going to have, right? Yeah. But that's a cool thing because it was being used as a kind of a point into an entry point into this really detailed legal discussion about a point of law. And it was like, here's an academic who thinks, it should go this way or that way. And so the judges were actually debating with each other, but using the article as kind of the way to do that. So it was like, wow, that's very interesting. Parliamentary committees, that's another great way that law academics can have impact. We actually, with our students, we teach a subject on, commissions and inquests and inquiries. And we get our students, as part of the assessment, to actually write a submission to a parliamentary inquiry. I'll tell you, working for a parliamentary committee, it's pretty amazing. Even as a law student, you can get the attention of politicians and they will look at what your submission is, and often it will be cited or referred to in the report that comes later. They'll put a footnote in and they'll say, see what, whatever the name is, has written on this topic, and they made a submission. So you want to talk about impact in terms of policy making, a great opportunity to do that. And I've done a lot of submissions to inquiries over the years as well, in a variety of jurisdictions also. So it's really exciting that, yes, you can learn about the law, you can be a technical expert, but you can actually then find good ideas and kind of nudge the system in a way to try and, you can influence it in that way to hopefully get to a better outcome. Yeah.
That's inspiring stuff. That's like really a powerful stories. So you've maintained your love of tech all the way through. Yeah. So you're this whole question of where does AI fit in with the law? Yeah. Just coming back to that, because this is a great. Your story is somewhat, it's traced through, a period of change, societal change. You've moved to different places and technology. And now we're in this space where, as you say, no one actually knows, no one can claim this is where law jobs are going or this is where law education is going. But it's a matter of getting better prepared at the moment. How concerned are you about AI and cheating? Everybody, we might as well go there because everyone will ask the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, one of the challenges, I've seen studies on this that show that academics actually cannot, with a great level of certainty, identify when AI is being used in an assessment. So this is something that universities as a whole are going to have to grapple with. It's not just in law, but it's obviously across all disciplines. So students are using it to polish their writing. They're using it for, research. They're using it for all kinds of purposes. As I'm sure probably instructors are as well. Everyone is using tools that are available to them, right? So the question is, how do you maintain integrity in an assessment regime? And it could be you don't want to make people not, have access or use the tools. If they're going to go into the workplace
sure.
and use those tools,
Absolutely.
they need to get familiar with how the tools work
You can't
and the
just
limitations.
pretend that it doesn't exist and then stick him in a room with a little table and a bench.
Exactly
Yeah.
right. Exactly right. It'd be like saying you can't use a calculator, right?
Yeah.
Like, do you remember the old
Exactly.
math classes? Like,
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
use the
yeah,
calculator. It's like, but someone invented the calculator, and it's pretty
Yeah,
useful,
yeah, yeah.
right? Like, you have to be able to use it. So I know this is like the next level, but I think what we're going to do in law. So law in particular has a lot of accreditation rules and requirements around the degree that we offer. So the Victorian Legal Admissions Board, which I mentioned, they've adopted these kind of rules about prescribed areas of knowledge, and we have to demonstrate to their satisfaction that our graduates have not only taken those subjects that have those prescribed areas of knowledge, like contracts and torts and constitutional law and criminal law and evidence and all these things, but also that they have an understanding and a competence in those areas. And so for us, the challenge is, well, how do you do that? And how do we do it? We do it with invigilated exams. So you can't, you close the laptop and off you go, back to pen and paper in some cases. Now in Canada, they actually do have a laptop, but you have a special program that blocks off, the internet or whatever. So we haven't quite got that where I am, but this kind of thing is a way of having, an authentic assessment that shows that the student really has absorbed and has an understanding of that subject area. I wonder, back in the old days, oral exams were a thing.
That's kind of what I think too.
I mean, you
Surely
can do
that's
that,
kind of
right?
where it's going to go.
Yeah, so let's probe a little bit on this, kind of like this podcast.
Yeah.
You can have a student sit down. It's quite intimidating. But mind you, if you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to have to get used to it, right? Like, being interviewed, if you're going to speak before a judge or a tribunal, you need to be able to answer questions, in the hot seat, so to speak. And so, having an oral exam or some kind of evaluation that's based on, an understanding that the student can communicate effectively, the knowledge that they have, gained and acquired. So I think probably where we're headed in all of this is, those core subjects for accreditation, they will always have to have some kind of a competency test that is a fail-safe, so AI can't be used. Maybe people will use it on preliminary assessments, interim assessments, right? There's like a little paper you're writing, a research memo or whatever. Great. One thing, if I can just talk about this as well, and this relates to that, in elective subjects, so like doing a placement, for example, like in that clinic that I mentioned, Whittlesea Community Connections Partnership there. If you were to go in that clinic, what is the ability for you to then use AI tools in assisting you, talking to the clients, understanding the client's needs, doing the legal research, being able to then give, very clear communication about what the, the legal, outcome should be, or, the steps that they need to take in terms of that advice. So can we, and one thing I'd love to do at La Trobe, and this is something I want to be a leader on actually, is looking at ways to harness the power of AI in something like an elective subject, like a placement, because we're not worried about the core curriculum in that instance. But you actually then go into a real setting with real clients, just like a law firm is actually going to be using this sort of stuff. And you actually then can start using these tools. And I would say, and this is just my idea, but an AI firm that has a legal AI, and I've worked with people that have developed specific legal AIs. There's one in Canada I've worked with at Queen's University in Ontario. It's called the Open Justice Initiative. It's a really interesting free legal AI. There's an access to justice problem that these AI companies are trying to solve, because what they can say is our tool can be used by people themselves. So people who don't have a lawyer, for example, or can't afford a lawyer, they then can at least get a form filled out.
Yeah. Makes it accessible, right?
It makes it more accessible. Now, there's dangers and risks with that kind of thing. And, the Supreme Court of Victoria, the Supreme Court of New South Wales, they've issued guidance on when it's appropriate and not appropriate to use AI. There's a lot of dangers around evidence-related documents like affidavits, for example, because it will reword things that a witness might have seen. And that's a problem because they might not have seen it exactly in that way, right? And so the evidence becomes a bit, unreliable because AI will try to make it the most polished version, of that. So if the witness is just saying, this is what I saw, it was a dark night, I saw this car drive up, whatever, and you put it into AI, whoop, you're going to get a clean version of it. And it's not necessarily what that person genuinely
I was
saw,
reading about the New South Wales Police. I'm not sure if you're across this, but they were piloting. I mean, I know they've done a lot of work around facial recognition and looking at leveraging AI for crime prevention. But I know also similar to this, that they've kind of been piloting and leveraging AI from a dictation point of view. And there's been a lot of this guy's very early, and they're trying to figure out, well, how do we kind of use this as a tool? So, you know, they've got limited resource. So, you know, police can spend more time on the front lines. How can we kind of leverage the technology to aid them in kind of some of the back end? But to your point, there's risks in terms of like, we have to be very careful around how that technology is kind of used in that context.
Absolutely. And I would say the large language models in particular. So if you look at a traditional computer program, it's a very defined, you know, it's a series of logic statements essentially. There's no discretion for the program to just make something up. You know, it's very much like if this, then that, go to this routine. Sure. So everything is sort of anticipated by the programmer, and you have a very kind of concrete sort of set of rules that apply. Whereas large language models, and you can still have AI kind of in that system in a way, but large language models are much more open-ended for the system itself to, you know, essentially use a predictive model, right? To kind of guess at what the right answer should be. And the problem with that, I mean, there's a lot of challenges, but hallucination is a big one, right? And when it's something that's so technical like law, and every word matters, every case reference matters. There's a case in Melbourne of a lawyer who used an AI, partly AI generated list of cases, submitted to the family court, and the judge went back to her chambers and couldn't find those cases. And their associate couldn't find those cases either. And so the lawyer was then referred for a disciplinary.
Because I know in the US, there was a big one in 2023 that obviously got a whole bunch of notoriety. But I didn't realize that happened here.
It's happening here
as well.
It's happening here. So this is the sort of thing is like, how much can you trust it? And again, we'll go back to those graduate positions, right? If the students aren't learning how to do this themselves, do they have the discernment to be able to do that, right? You got to be able to go find those cases. Is that point of law accurate? You know, I've used AI where it's actually taken the dissenting opinion from a court of appeal, and it treated that as if that was the majority opinion. And so it flipped the order of what the law was and what the law wasn't. And unless you really knew that case inside out and backwards, you actually wouldn't maybe pick up on that straight away.
So just on that, do you have to change teaching so that you can get them? Like, is it a new subject, or is it embedded into each subject?
So AI technology,
and how to recognize where that is a problem or how it's flipped. Yeah.
So this is the sort of thing where, I mean, the students, you know, you want to really double check everything, right? And they're learning very fast. Because look, if you're the instructor and you're marking a bunch of assessment, you're going to be going through and you're like, wait a second. That is not right. This case, I know this case, right? Like you're the expert in that subject area. Yeah. And there's a contracts case, maybe a classic one, you know, from the English, you know, Court of Queen's Bench or whatever. And you're thinking, gosh, that does not look quite right to me. And so that sort of stuff is going to get picked up on. Now, the challenge, of course, with these academic integrity issues is what can you prove and what can you not prove? Even on a balance of probabilities, 51, you know, there's a lot of circumstantial.
Could I just jump in there, though, Loren? Because I think maybe the bigger issue is that how do you actually teach it? Like, so if how do I, as a green 19-year-old student, work out, well, AI flipped it, and the majority case is suddenly the dissenting and vice versa, and AI has done it in the course of my study?
So I think what you need to do, I think the instructor needs to, and I think this is what we're doing more and more, is we're actually having group discussions in the small groups around the use of AI and using examples like that to then illustrate the point, right? So let's look at a paper that was submitted last, you know, anonymized, we'll de-identify it. This is a paper that a student submitted last time. And here's what happened, right? So the AI was obviously used in some way to summarize the law, and here's where the limitations were, the problems were. In fact, it got the law totally wrong. Yeah. And so if you were advising a client and you used this tool and you didn't double check that, actually, you would have given the client wrong advice, right? So that's a real problem. So I think unpacking those in the class.
Student's going to use it and then unpack it in each class.
I think we have to.
We got to run it. Right?
We have to. Yeah. It's, you know, in a way, I mean, even just for polishing people's writing, I mean, this is the one thing. People are using it. If you're not using it, like, you're kind of almost at a disadvantage these days, right? Yeah. You know, if you want to compose an email, bang, you put in your dot points, compose an email, and it's a draft, right? Yeah. You're going to, you know, there might be some things wrong. But again, when it's mission critical stuff, when it's law, about particular points of law, references to case law. The other thing is, you know, these hallucinations, I mean, I've had cases where, you know, it will refer very convincingly to a statute. You know, here's a Commonwealth statute, you know, the Act, and Section 3B, subsection 2 says whatever. And then you go and read it, and some of the words are different in the actual legislation compared to what, and that is a massive problem. If you were quoting that to a judge or, even to your client giving advice, as I mentioned, one word, a whole case can, hinge on a single word, right? And so this has to be like 100%. There's no room for error in this sort of thing.
And because the repercussions are you lose your right to practice, right? That's kind of...
You can be disciplined. You can. So, I mean, if there can be someone even bring a lawsuit against you for malpractice, right? So there's lots of reasons to not do that. You have a duty to your client, right? Obviously, and and to the court as well, to be candid, to be accurate, to not mislead. And so these are the lawyer's professional obligations. And so the ethics around this, around using it, and I think it's not to say that you can't use it, but the thing is, how do you have the right controls in place to review what's coming out, to have the human in the loop still somehow, to actually exercise that judgment over the AI and to say, that's not right. And I can tell you, I ran an experiment on AI. So I presented last December at a scrutiny conference it was held at the state parliament here in Melbourne. And it was an interesting experiment. I tested 4 AI platforms, and the work that I mentioned for that Senate committee. So what I did is I tried to train each of these platforms to do the work that I do by giving advice. It's all publicly available information. But what I did is I took a year's worth of the reports of that committee, and the committee reports very frequently, publishes all its decisions and why it's deciding the things it's doing. And I trained the AI, each of those 4 platforms, go and read, all these, previous years worth of reports from this committee. Learn the nuance. Learn where they draw the line, where they're kind of willing to let some things go maybe, and they're going to stick firm on something else, right? So you learn kind of in a sophisticated way, kind of the way the committee approaches its task. Then I gave it 8 examples where one by one, here's a new law, analyze the law, tell me what you think about the law. Are there any issues? Are there any problems here, essentially? And so the AI would go through and it would get it wrong. I mean, it was a nightmare. It was a disaster, frankly. And so then I would go and sit with the AI and I would, through prompting, and say, okay, let's see where you went wrong in this one, right? You made about 10 mistakes, so let's go through each one of those mistakes, and you're going to learn from those mistakes and don't repeat them again, and this is why it's wrong, and this is what you should have done, basically. And then I do that 8 times, so like 8 deep dives. It's like teaching a student, basically, right? And, it's very interesting. And then I gave it one final real test, right? And this was very interesting. Only one of them got what I would say was a decent score, was ChatGPT. Some of the other ones failed absolutely miserably, and they just couldn't do the analysis, right? But even ChatGPT, it got a score of 60-some%, which I gave it. I evaluated it, and I was looking at it. It's like, I guess for like a first cut, if you just need, it's like having a junior assistant or something. It's like, it's not going to be ready. It's not going to be prime time ready, Yeah. But it was like, there were a few interesting things. I was like, okay, it identified that issue, but it missed a whole bunch of stuff there. And that one's actually a false flag. It's not even relevant at all. And so it was okay, but it was definitely nowhere near what you would need for this level of hyper technical precision.
So, that's kind of to your point. I think it's like at that level, I think, it's going to be hard. It's going to take a lot of time. And I think to your point, you kind of need people who can call on the Rolodex of experience and, in the field, deep knowledge of kind of these types of legislation. I think practically, here within our business, we're, law and legal, I understand our contract, our services agreement really well because all of our clients are in a services agreement. I know kind of where the challenges are, but I think for me, where I've seen it really help practically has been just trying to interpret and make me understand what is actually being kind of referenced and said. And it's like whether it's a new supplier agreement and I'm trying to get a summary to kind of understand it, and I've trained it on kind of our services agreement. It's helpful for that. Or just, hey, if we're getting an amendment to a service agreement, what are the risks? But again, to your point, it's kind of about me understanding, what it means versus I'd then go to our lawyer, Paul, to basically if I wasn't sure, I'd go to Paul to actually get it drafted. But certainly the gap now is I can get the information just way faster, like at my fingertips. I don't have to wait for Paul for a couple of days. Yeah, and it's free. So,
which is always good.
Yeah, that's a good thing too, right?
Yeah.
Cuts down on the cost. And as you say, sometimes distilling complex information, like, can be really good at that. So giving you kind of a layperson summary, or, even, lawyers are using it in ways to, run through contracts, for example, or, we do document review, right?
Yeah.
Like, and just quickly find, key phrases or things that look a bit, there might be a risk in there somewhere for the client. But again, it's that kind of first draft of some work, and it might be good enough for particular purposes, right? What you're talking about. You just want to quickly get a summary. Okay, what does this mean? What is in it for me? What's the risk here? But, you don't need like maybe that full-blown, legal opinion about it. It's just kind of a quick and ready way of getting the information that you just need now. But you're going to go to your lawyer if you do need a concrete or, a definitive answer to that question. So,
Loren, I reckon we're pretty much out of time. But can you sum up, just give us one last thought on where do you think AI is going to make a lawyer's job better in 5 years' time?
So I think it will cut down on the more mundane tasks. I think lawyers will be able to apply their skills in a way where it's more sophisticated kind of work that they actually really, you're paying them. I'll just give you an example. If you're a tax lawyer, gosh, they make probably the highest rate, per hour. Yeah. Sometimes, $1,000 or more an hour, right? You don't really want your tax lawyer doing mundane things.
Yeah.
They have a very intricate, detailed knowledge of how all the pieces fit together, all the primary legislation, the delegated legislation, all the case law interpreting that legislation. They understand complex corporate structures and everything. And if they are, sort of spending 3 or 4 hours of that time, that it's $1,000 an hour, doing kind of more mundane tasks of, what's the latest kind of case law here, doing kind of some basic research things, it's probably not a good use of their time. So I think it will cut down. I think it will make legal services delivery more efficient. It will essentially be, a collaborator in some way, but I think the lawyers are ultimately still going to have to be able to, sign the memo, and they have to have confidence in that, and they need to do the checking of it. But I think it will remove some of that work. The other thing is, I think the access to justice is a really important part. I think it will actually assist those who otherwise cannot afford traditional legal representation. I think you're also going to get a lot of startup firms coming. Yeah, for sure. So probably the future of law. We have these very kind of old-fashioned models in a way, right? It's like a partnership.
Yeah.
And it's like I can't use that word, but there's the partners, and then there's the senior associates, and then the intermediate associates, and the junior associates, and then the graduate students. And so I've been there. I worked as a lawyer. I am a lawyer, right? Yeah. So that model, and there's been a lot of kind of attacks on that model. Sure. The billable hour, should it even exist anymore? And so, but this kind of Richard Susskind in the UK wrote a lot about the future of law and about the debundling of legal services. So you're going to get little firms just offering one niche thing, right? Yeah. And I think AI will accelerate that trend. I think the legal landscape in the future, what a lawyer looks like and how, in the kind of place they work in, is probably going to change quite significantly. There still may be a room for those, big old-fashioned law firms with multinational corporations, and there's a certain kind of a work there that may never actually totally go away. But I think for kind of day-to-day practical legal matters, drafting a will or looking at a contract, signing a lease, whatever. I think you're going to see probably more debundling of legal services and more kind of little startup firms that they use AI in an effective way to kind of maximize value for clients. And so maybe the cost of these sorts of things could come down actually quite significantly as well.
And I hope from a public service point of view, it creates efficiencies and helps to speed things up because, our courts are incredibly congested. It takes I've got friends going through family courts at the moment, and to be sitting sometimes in some really average situations, well, a lot of the time, to be waiting for 6 months to a year for cases to be heard or seen, hopefully through the power of technology, rather than just a huge investment and outlay of costs, we can see more efficiency and, people being able to get to a resolution much kind of faster.
I agree. And actually, it's a great point you raised about the courts themselves. So I would say, we talked about the old fashioned, and I don't want to use the word dinosaur, but I'll just use it. But there's an old model, right, of doing things. Law is very traditional. It has a lot of, tradition and culture built into it. There's a certain way of doing things. When I studied in the UK, I was at Cambridge, it's 800 years old. Law has been taught there for 600 years, I think. It wasn't from the very beginning, and Henry VIII abolished abolished, like this, the canon law, which was the church law. This place is very old. And you see those traditions are still in there, right? The wigs and the way that, the protocols are in the courtroom. And it's very, very, and there's some good reasons for that, right? I mean, the law is kind of a stable force, and, there's these kind of respected institutions, and they have a certain, obviously a big power, a big role to play and a lot of power in our community. But I guess one thing will be, will judges use it, and when will they use it, and how will they use it? So family law is a great example. The family court already has a tool that they use. So when there is, a dissolution of a marriage, for example, you have to then make a very complex kind of accounting for the division of the family property. So looking at kind of all the assets and, these sorts of things. And then, if there's questions about support or, there's children involved. And so kind of doing the financial analysis, there's a lot of variables and factors that feed into that.
So much cost as well.
So much cost as well. But they're using tools already in that kind of way, actually, which is great. So let's say you get, fired from your job, right? Did you have to have a notice period? If so, how long? So these kinds of calculations actually are really kind of ripe for that sort of thing, and not just the final word, but here's the reasoning, here's the list of kind of assets or the length of time and the seniority of the role. It can you can identify the 30 or 40 or 50 factors and get AI to kind of do a first draft of what the balance of all those factors, what the right answer might be. And so courts may use it. In Canada, there's a tribunal that is totally online. In British Columbia, the Civil Resolution Tribunal, it's only for low-level disputes, so things about landlord tenancy below a certain amount. And so this is an online court, and it's an official court, like it's government sanctioned, and its remedies have legal effect. And so you can go and basically you fill out a form 24 hours a day, you upload your evidence, and it basically drafts some letters to help you to try to resolve your dispute in the first instance. If not, it will go kind of through this semi-automated process where there's still a person involved.
Well, thank you so much. Cool. I feel like we could talk about these topics for hours. It's been wonderful to have you on the show. I'm sure everyone would have found it extremely interesting. If people want to find you, where's kind of the easiest way to find you on the internet?
I'd say LinkedIn, probably. So you just search my name, Loren Neudorf, and I'll pop up, and I'm happy to connect.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Loren.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.